I'm going to get started. My name is Sean Smith, and I want to thank you for coming out today to my author talk and book reading. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and your vacation day to spend a little bit of time with me to talk about my love of national parks and of writing. This is an interactive conversation, so if you have questions throughout, feel free to ask me. We did this one time at the Covington Library, and I think it generated a lot of good conversation. I want to talk about today, well, that's me. So basically, I got a couple questions I want to answer. Why do I write thrillers? What's my current book? And what's next? But again, if you have ideas or you have questions throughout, feel free to ask those, okay? All right, so first question. Why do I write thrillers? So I've actually written 3 thrillers so far. The first one was called Unleashing Coulter's Hell, and it's set in Yellowstone National Park. We're going to talk a little bit more about it here in a second. The second one is called Lost Cause, and that's set in Civil War battlefields back on the East Coast. And then the third one, which is my most current book, is called Need to Know, and it's set here at Mount Rainier National Park. And we're going to go a little more in depth into this one. But those are my 3 books. So why do I write thrillers? Well, a little bit about myself. I'm actually a former park ranger. Back in the 90s, I was a park ranger at Glacier National Park, the North Cascades, Yellowstone, and I also spent some time at Mount St. Helens as a forest ranger. Well, for some of you, if you've been to Yellowstone, I worked at Grant Village, which is in the southernmost part of the park and very isolated. And the closest place to get, say, your laundry or groceries was in Jackson Hole. And it was about a 60 to 70 minute drive down there. So on days you had to make basically a production to get down to do your laundry at those places. So I made it the whole day, and I'd go see movies and things like that on a day, because when you're in Yellowstone, there aren't things like that. We just had a great talk about what's appropriate and inappropriate in national parks, but I'd go see movies. And one of the movies I saw was at that time a James Bond movie. And so I was watching it. I've always liked James Bond. My name is Sean. As I told you, my parents named me after Sean Connery. So you can see there's a little bit of probably a thriller writer in my birth. But anyway, I'm watching this James Bond movie, and I'm watching James Bond, and he's rappelling off a cliff, and I go, as a park ranger, I've done that. I see James Bond flying a plane. Well, I'm a private pilot, and I've done that. I see James Bond, driving fast cars, and I've been trained in law enforcement, and we drive fast cars. I'm like, I've done all these things. Park rangers do amazing things. The only thing I didn't do is chase terrorists through, a European village. But other than that, a lot of the things that James Bond was doing, your park rangers do every single day. So I was like, man, a park ranger would make a great central character for a thriller. Well, this was back in 1997. I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and I kind of put that story aside. But like I said, when I was in these parks, at Grant Village, for example, or Stehekin. Has anyone been to Stehekin in the North Cascades? It's considered the most isolated community in the lower 48. The only way you can get there is by plane, or walking, or by boat. There are no roads to Stehekin. So as you can imagine, when the sun went down, it got pretty isolated there. So I spent a lot of time reading. And a lot of the type of books I like to read are these thrillers. I really like Dan Brown. I like Tom Clancy. I like James Bond series, and I like Indiana Jones. All of those things tend to resonate with me. And so I was really interested in this. So I had the idea of a park ranger to make a great central character. I've read hundreds of thrillers. I'm like, maybe this would make a great book. So I fast forward, and I was about 2012. I got a life coach, and he said, well, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, I've had this idea for a book for a very long time, but I'm not a writer. I don't write. I've never written anything. And he's like, well, let's just do it. What can it hurt? So at that time, I was working in downtown Seattle. I had a 45-minute train ride in and a 45-minute train ride out. And I wrote my first book on this computer here in those 45 minutes. And that coach basically said, if you can write about 500 words a day, in a year, you have 300 pages and you have a book. Took me a little longer than that to do that, but it basically is just finding that time, that discipline to write and do that every day over and over. So I've told some people, some days it's really easy. The words are just kind of pulled out of they just fall out of my head. I'm like, I can't stop writing. And other days it's drudgery. It's hard to get those words to come out and to just get anything on the page. But like I said, on average, about 300 to 500 words a day, you have a book at a year. So having a good central character and a location, that's only part of the story. I worked with my coach on saying, well, what really motivates you about these thrillers? And what is it about them that attracts you to write a book? And I said, well, you have to think about, I'm sure for these writers, they answered the central question, well, what am I most afraid of? What really terrifies me? And having worked in national parks, I'm not afraid of things like bears or mountain lions. I've spent a lot of time around them, but living in Yellowstone National Park, one of the things I would tell people, that is a giant super volcano. And about every 600,000 years, geologists tell us it erupts. And it will make Mount St. Helens look tiny. We're going to talk about that in a second. So I'm thinking, hey, we're living on a volcano that actually has a cycle of every 600,000 years having an eruption. And does anyone know when the last eruption of Yellowstone was? No answer. About 600,000 years ago. So I was kind of leading a hike one time, and I'm like, I wonder what would happen if someone were able to transport a nuclear device to Yellowstone and detonate that. Would it erupt? Would it cause the volcano to erupt? And so then I had my idea for the story. It was going to be set in Yellowstone, and as you can see, kind of up in the top left there, one of the things that terrifies me are extinction events. These large, massive natural disasters that we would have a lot of difficulty responding to. So that's something that I was always intrigued with. How could we get that into a story, a thriller, and see if the character, the main hero, could prevent that from happening? And so I had to think about how would you get a nuclear device into Yellowstone? Where would you put it? What would it look like? How would the Park Service, my central character called Grayson Cole, how would he respond? And what would happen? So that was my first book. The second one, I started to think about where we are today. There's a lot of disunion and there's a lot of disorganization. Well, what would it take to start a second civil war? I wonder what would trigger that off. It seems unrealistic or it might not happen, but it's possible. So I actually came up with an idea of some item that had been lost during the Civil War that these people were looking to get, and they felt that it had the power to help them start a second revolution. And so that was my second book, called Lost Cause. And then my third book, which is down here on the left, I'm concerned about invasion. What if something were to just take over the planet and we wouldn't be able to respond to it? And in doing these things, one of the things that's interesting about writing books is you have your first idea, and as you start writing, you start getting, hey, that'd make a great idea for another book. So my coach said there's always three books. There's the book you've written, the book you're writing, and the book you're going to write. And so you're always working on those three books. So while I was writing Lost Cause, I read about this incident that happened here at Mount Rainier, and that became the genesis for my third book. And we'll talk about that too. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Do you have a longhand write? You always write on the computer, or is it any different?
So I have not really written, although I take notes. So the question was, do I longhand write any of my stories? I have written on just about every type of electronic device you can think of, from my iPhone, just tapping away when I get ideas, to writing on that, to writing on iPads. I will sometimes make notes if I don't have those, to basically say, make sure you think about this and put it in my pocket and go back. But most of my books are written on this computer right here. And then one of the things you have to worry about is that, what if that computer crashes and you lose your manuscript? I basically I email my book to myself, so it's sitting on Yahoo's server, so at least I won't, if I lose my computer, gets stolen, crashes, I have another copy somewhere. So that's kind of what I do there. Gosh, there was something else I was going to say about that. Well, anyway, this is my first book. It came out in 2012. It's self-published. So one of the questions or answers, questions I get a lot is, man, it must be hard writing books. Well, my short answer is, writing books is easy. Selling books is really hard. If you've got a book in your head and you've got time to write it, there are ways to get your book published now. You can get any one of your books published. And this is called Kindle Direct Publishing. CreateSpace is also accompanied by Amazon. They will walk you through the process. You upload your manuscript. They can help you design the covers for those. And then you can either order it by Kindle and it downloads immediately, or they will individually print your book, which I think is unbelievable. I don't have to buy 5,000 copies of my book and then sell them. You buy it, it gets made in some warehouse, and it's shipped and it goes right to your door. And unless you knew that this was self-published, there is no way of knowing that this is just something that is a very low print volume. And as long as I keep it up on Amazon, it'll be available for print forever. So it's a great service, and I can't promote it enough. If you've got a book, like I said, you can get it published today. The next step, obviously, is trying to find an agent and take it to the next level. Amazon, so these books online are about $9. Anyone have any idea how much I get of that? I get $1 on printed books. Kindle downloads, they're $1. You have any idea how much money I get for that? I get 25 cents for those books. So it's better, as my grandfather used to say, it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, but I'm not able to retire yet. So I'm doing things like this to try and promote my books, get more sales, and hopefully it'll take off on Amazon. But like I said, if you've got a book, and you've got an idea, and you've got time, you can get it published now. So this is my first book, before this, Unleashing Coulter's Hell, came out in 2012. It's about getting a nuclear device in Yellowstone, and then the Park Service having to try and stop that. And so I highly recommend it. I've actually gotten reviews on this book as well. There was a defunct magazine now called Ranger Magazine. They did a review of it. I've gotten reviews on other sources as well. But if you want to follow the story sequentially, this is the first one. It starts with Grayson Cole as a ranger who just happens to work at Grant Village. Isn't that kind of funny how that works? So I've used my Park Service experience to bring some realism to what actually park rangers do. And so I think much the public has a certain image or view of park rangers, but there's also a lot of limits on what they can and can't do. Resources, the types of vehicles they drive, that sort of thing. But I talk about all those using that experience that they have to actually thwart the villain. I went to the Ranger Academy in Santa Rosa, and when we were going through it, they said, one of the things that's different about a park ranger law enforcement is that in a big city, when a police officer is patrolling, it's more often than not that the people they're interacting with know the neighborhood better than the law enforcement officer. But in the parks, it's exactly the opposite. The rangers know the area much better than the criminals that are working through the park. And I actually write about that and use that. The ranger knows things that the criminal would not know, and that's how he helps outwit him. Oh, this is just talking about that I like to take stories that are relevant and in the news right now. People often talk about, well, what are the chances of that? This is a story that just ran actually about things that are happening in Yellowstone, the world's largest supervolcano. And there are earthquakes in that park just about every day. And people are watching it, and basically at one point in the recent past, it had this giant heave. It was like the Park Service, or the park was actually breathing, and Yellowstone Lake actually was sloshing to one end. Slowly, the scientists had put sticks in to measure the lake's surface, and he came back at one point and noticed that someone had moved his sticks. And he was like, what the heck is going on? And so the sticks were much deeper in the lake than he'd originally put them in. Well, slowly he realized that actually his sticks had not moved. It was the lake that was actually moving. And like a giant bathtub, one end was being lifted up and moving the lake to the other end. And they were actually concerned at one point that this might mean or trigger an eruption. It eventually went back down and the lake resettled at its previous level. But this is the types of ideas I'm like, if that were to go off, and I've got a picture here, how significant an impact would this be? And this is the area where we would see ash in the United States alone. So one of the things I was thinking about, that these terrorists that attack the United States, they must get frustrated at times that they're not able to actually deal a significant or lethal blow. Well, how would you do that in the United States? And I said, if you could get Yellowstone to erupt, that would basically be lights out for the United States, if not most of the planet. You can see in this picture, I just took this off the TV the other day, the red is where the near direct impacts would be, but even those greens are where ash could be up to 5 or 6 feet. I mean, that would wipe out crops, it would cause houses to collapse, it would be devastating if we had Yellowstone go off. So that's kind of what I was dealing with there. As I said, my next book is Lost Cause. It starts in Gettysburg, which is a park I've been to a number of times. I didn't work there, but I've been to it at least a half dozen to a dozen times. And was thinking about, during the Antietam campaign, General Lee lost some orders that were for his campaign into Maryland. And that's actually true, and so they found him, the Union forces were using those, and then I thought, well, what if there was something else attached to those that had some source of power that people wanted to collect and get that could motivate them and help them launch another civil war? And this book actually then goes all over the East Coast, from different battlefield to different battlefield, talking about a chase to find that artifact before the terrorists find it and unleash it on the United States. And just so happens that they found, mine was a little box that they were looking for. This is a time capsule that was just recently found back east in Virginia. It's a Confederate time capsule. It's got Confederate money in it, it's got a flag, other Confederate type memorabilia, and I was like, God, that sounds like the start of my book, actually. So it's actually, these types of things are turning up and actually happening. Now, whether that leads to a civil war, I don't know. I haven't heard anything about that yet. So my current book is called Need to Know, and it's set here in Mount Rainier. And so when like I said, when I'm doing writing my books, I'm always getting ideas about what the next book is. And as I was writing Lost Cause, I just came across that, well, let me ask this. Does anyone know where the first UFO sighting was in the United States? Yep, it was right here at Mount Rainier in 1947. People always say Roswell, New Mexico, but it actually happened here at Mount Rainier. And this gentleman here was flying back from down in, I believe in Chehalis, from a conference, flying his plane near Mount Rainier. We're going to read about it here in a minute. And he reported seeing these silver saucers off in the distance, 9 of them, and they flew right past Mount Rainier and then jetted off toward Yakima. He reported it. That's the first time the term flying saucers was used. And then just a couple weeks later, there was the crash at Roswell, and that got all the attention because it made this big story. And then the Army declared that they had found a flying saucer, and then later said they didn't find one. But I came up with this idea, and I said, well, what if something actually had crashed on Mount Rainier? What if something's been buried up there for 70 years? Who would want to find it? What could it be? And what would that mean for the Earth and the planet if there was actually something buried up there? So that's how it starts. That's how Need to Know starts, and we'll talk about it here in a second. So, as I said, you've got a book that you've written, a book that you're writing, and a book you've written, a book you're working on, the book you're going to write. So what am I working on next? Well, as I was working on Need to Know, I thought, man, fires really seem to be getting out of control now. There seems to be a lot more wildfires, a lot more impact. But I also know that the Park Service, and if you listen to the previous talk, there is a balance between preservation and use. And at Yellowstone, I don't know how many of you know this, but they found bacteria in the hot pools there that they now use to do DNA sampling, DNA sequencing. Well, that now is a $1 billion industry, and the Park Service got very little for that, and that's led to a lot of reform and change that if resources are taken out of the park to be used, that the federal government should get a cut on that. Well, I put in a combination of, there actually is research going on the brains of bears. When they hibernate, they do have a decrease or loss of memory, but they seem to be their brains seem to rebound very quickly. And there's a lot of promising research going on into a cure for Alzheimer's from looking at how bears' brains adapt. So I was like, well, wow, that'd be interesting. What if there was a genetic lab at Glacier National Park, one that I worked at, that actually was looking into how these bears' brains adapt to that hibernation and then recover from that long sleep. But then you throw in a wildfire, and then that genetic lab burns to the ground, destroying the cure. Who might want that to happen? Who might benefit from actually destroying the cure for Alzheimer's? And so one of the things that's different about this next book that I'm writing, it's actually a mystery. So does anyone know the difference between a thriller and a mystery? I didn't know this before I started writing. So a thriller is actually a quest by the hero to prevent something bad from happening. So that person's going out and knows that there's a threat, and they go out and try and stop it. A mystery is actually when something bad has already happened, and the hero is trying to find out who the person is that's responsible. Between you and me, I like thrillers. I know how to write those. Mysteries are hard because you have to leave little clues all the way through to kind of lead the way on who did what when. This has been a much harder book for me to write, to actually think about how do I make sure that the clues point to the right person, but also it seemed to also be pointing to the wrong people at the same time. And it's a much more difficult, I'm scratching a different part of my brain as I write this book. But actually, it deals in Glacier on these massive wildfire that goes through. My hero is the same person that's gone through all 3 books. Working for the Park Service, I also know that park rangers move a lot, so that makes it possible to actually take my first hero and have him in Yellowstone. He then moves to Gettysburg, then he goes to Mount Rainier, and now he's going to end up at Glacier Park. And that is a fairly typical career for a park ranger. So all of these things tend to resonate with people that actually know what the Park Service is about and how it operates. So he's going to be at Glacier, they're going to be fighting a wildfire, and then just so happens this genetic lab burns to the ground, and they've got to figure out who did it. This is the cover for my next book. One of the things I've learned to do as well is to do this type of art, to actually create my own covers. It gets, when you're writing, you've got a lot of ideas. You actually, with self-publishing, a lot of these things you have to do yourself. There obviously are services out there that you can pay that will help create your cover, but it costs, several $100s. And as you heard, I've only been selling a handful of books and get a quarter, so I'm already in the hole when I do that. So I try and create my own covers and art and learn these skills as well. So it's Adobe Photoshop, and I just try and take pictures and create my own artwork, minimize the cost as much as I possibly can. This actually is a grizzly bear that we saw when we went to Glacier Park a number of years ago, just off the side of the road. It was a pretty amazing day with my kids. So, but that book should be coming out, if not this year, then early next year. So look for it then. So what else is coming? So I'm always thinking, and I'm always thinking about these kind of, like what I said, extinction events, revolution, invasion. And so as the climate changes and the world heats up, some of the permafrost up in Alaska and up in the Arctic is starting to melt. And they're starting to see that there are viruses that have been frozen up there for tens of thousands of years are now starting to be warmed up and actually come back to life. Well, no human alive today has any medical defense against these viruses. We have basically evolved since then without being exposed to these viruses. What's that going to mean when these viruses start waking up? What if somebody wants to wake those viruses up? What if somebody knows that those viruses are there and wants to get them and possibly weaponize those viruses? This is probably one of my next book is going to be moving out there. This bottom one on the right, when I worked at Mount St. Helens, how many people have been to Mount St. Helens? Up to Spirit Lake, Spirit Lake. So when Mount St. Helens erupted, the whole south side of the volcano basically fell off and landed in Spirit Lake and created a massive tidal wave that went across the lake and splashed up on the far hillside about 800 feet. And the reason they know that is because all of the trees up to 800 feet are now gone. They're back down in the lake. Well, that got me thinking. I was watching the Discovery Channel one time about these mega tsunamis, these giant waves that can be created. and they point to an island off of Spain that has a giant hillside that actually is slowly sloughing away. And they believe that if that were to fall off in a cataclysm, it would create a tidal wave that would go across the Atlantic and wipe out the entire eastern seaboard. So I'm thinking, all right, who might be wanting to basically cause that tidal wave? How would you do that? And what would happen and how would you prevent that? So that's another book that I'm thinking about. And then the one on the bottom left, about the migration across from Asia into Alaska. Are there potential stories there as well? Are there things that they might find that would cause doubt on that migration or change what we think about it? Who might want to know about that? Who might want to change it? Who might fake that? Say that they put out evidence that actually contradicts what's going on. So these are all ideas. So there's always books, but again, like I said, it takes about 1.5 years to write these books. So from idea to actually finished and published is about 18 months, and that's a lot of time. So that's what, about another 3 or 4 years worth of writing before I can even get to that. Unless it was full time, and if there are any agents out there that want to hire me. So I have handouts here, and these are links to my books, as well as my Facebook site as well. And I want to hand those out if you want to take those. I think the people in the back might want them. Pass those out. This is where you can get my books and download them. You can also follow me on Facebook and my Twitter and my blog. But what I thought I'd do is, if before I read from the first chapter, if there were any more questions. Anyone's got questions?
So my one question is, have you thought about adapting this into screenplays?
So the question is, have I thought about adapting to screenplays? Yes, although I know even less about writing screenplays than I did about writing books. I don't think it would take a lot of effort to actually convert it to a screenplay. Getting someone to actually buy it and then promote it. My hope is basically that I just continue to put my books out there, that someone eventually will see it and say, hey, that makes for a great idea. That's something we might want to pick up and start selling or turn into a movie or something like that. We'll see. But yeah, I've thought about it. Just finding more time to do that is difficult. How about over here? Questions? Yeah.
It takes so much energy to do that, and you've got a full-time job on top of that. How do you find time to get coaching to get better as you go forward?
So the question is, you have a full-time job now, which I do. I work for the Washington State Department of Ecology down in Lacey. And then writing is almost could be a full-time job. How do I find time for coaching and support? So Kevin is actually one of my coaches. He works for Green River Community College, and they actually have a small business community center, development center that helps small businesses get up on marketing, a business plan, those sorts of things. I guess the short answer is I have to make time for these types of things. You've got to find time. So at lunch to work, that's when I write now. I have an hour for lunch. I go. It looks like I'm being antisocial, but I pull out my computer and I just write. And then other times, say during the football season, is a really good time for writing for me because I'm sitting for 3 hours watching a game. I can watch just enough to pay attention, but also be writing my books while I'm doing that too. But it's tough. You've got to be committed. It's not something that just falls out. You've got to be willing to put in the time to write a book. And like I said, this fourth one is very different than my other one, so it's much harder. I'm only 15,000 words in. Does anyone have an idea how many words you have to write for a book? One that would turn out to be about this size. It's about 75,000 words. That's about how much you have to have. And when I wrote Unleashing Coulter's Hell, my first book, I went through it, got done, it was 40,000 words. And I got some help from my coach. He's like, you're gonna have to double that in order for that to be considered something that people would be willing to buy. Well, I thought I'd written everything I needed to write. So I went back and went through and said, well, one of the things I realized as I was writing, I assumed things. I can see the book in my head and I can see the whole scene, but I wasn't always translating that onto the page. So I had to go in and say what the characters were wearing, where they were standing, what they were saying, were they fidgeting, all of those kind of additional details. I went back and got the book up to 75,000 words. So those are little tricks that you learn, but you always are looking for guidance and help and advice on how to continue to promote your books and get more ideas. Any other questions? Yeah. 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 So that's my mom, and my mom is saying that I got a lot of support from my family as well. So I was always running drafts by them. They read the book several times, and your family's probably the best critics because they won't hold anything back. Basically say, like my mom just said, this doesn't make any sense. What happened here? And as you get going, you write things, and I'm moving so fast that I would change people's names. She's like, wait, where did this person come from? You just changed this character's name, or you forgot. And like, so it's good to have somebody else read it that doesn't have those images in your head that can go, that just doesn't seem to go anywhere. Help me understand why this is and how you got to where you are. So, yes, definitely helps to have beta readers. Yes.
Did you use any of your family members or friends as characters and just change them a little bit?
No comment. Yes and no. I pulled inspiration from people and use. So one of the things I do as a writer is I watch people real closely to see what they're doing. I watch movies very closely to see how they're fidgeting or what they're doing. I read books much more closely too. Because if you just got, let's say you've got a conversation back and forth, it gets boring after a while. If they said, she said, what writers will do is they'll mix something in between there, like, the person went up to the desk and grabbed his book, started leafing through it, and then went on. You have to learn some of those tricks in order to kind of break up that conversation in order to make it more realistic. So it's just not this dull, repetitive, on and on and on. So what I do is I watch people, I watch movies, I read books closely to try and gain inspiration. I think my books have gotten better as I go. My first one may have been a little more on the detail side. You're going to learn a lot about Yellowstone when you read my book. And the other ones are getting more to be like your traditional thriller, more based in the place, more about the adventure, the excitement, that sort of thing. But as I also said, I draw heavily from my Park Service experience to say, how would they go about addressing that type of threat? So he'd say in this book, Need to Know, one of the things you need to do is get the hero and his accomplice and then the item isolated. So how would you do that? How would you get it because look, we're just a couple hours from the top of the volcano. If there was an emergency, we could have people up there. Helicopter could land very easily. So how do I make it so that the adventure and the drama gets more intense? What do? What could you do? A storm, exactly. You have a giant storm, and those happen all the time that would make it impossible for a helicopter to get up there. But that's what an author has to think about, because the writer or readers are going to go, well, why didn't they just fly a helicopter up there and pick it up and get the heck out? So I have to write those types of things in and go, a storm comes in and makes it impossible for a helicopter to get up, or anyone else to get up for that matter. Real life also changes my stories as well. My Unleashing Coulter's Hell started in 2012, and it's centered, like I said, on a nuclear device getting to Yellowstone National Park. Well, I had to think about where would you get a nuclear device? And at that time, the North Koreans were shooting a lot of rockets into the Pacific. I thought, well, what if one of those happened to have a nuclear device on it that someone got a hold of and then brought to the park? Well, that was Kim Jong-il at that time. Before I finished my book, he died. So I had him throughout the book. I had to go back and rewrite all of those sections where he was mentioned and put in his son. So real life will impact your book writing as well. So, well, any more questions? Yeah, okay, over here. This is my dad.
Give people an idea of what an idyllic life at Park Rainier. Tell them about the quarters in Yellowstone.
So I do have some park rangers in the back here. My dad just asked about what were my quarters like in Yellowstone National Park. So I was a seasonal park ranger, and seasonal rangers often get last dibs on quarters. And I lived in what was called Trailer 41 at that time, and it was a trailer that was brought into Yellowstone in the Eisenhower administration. So it was a single wide trailer. Its walls were paper thin. I shared it with another volunteer VIP. He had a small the room was big enough for a bed. He had one room, I had another. We had a bathroom in between, and the shower would leak into his closet, and so it would soak all of his uniforms every day. We had we had guests in our room just about every night, which were mice and raccoons. I remember one night something running across me in the middle of the night. I just kind of rolled over and said, I don't have time to get up and worry about this. We had elk and deer and bears walk by our little trailer. The moral or the end of that story is the next year I think they condemned it and basically tore it down and pulled it out of the park. So I was one of the last people to live in Trailer 41. I'm amazed it even survived. I mean, some of the winters were so harsh in that park that when I came, you actually had to walk through kind of a tunnel of snow to get up to the door. It was so much snow in that park. It was crazy. So that's kind of your typical stuff that you might have. I hope it's better today, but when I was a park ranger, it was pretty rustic. But you're doing it because you love that job. I mean, people would say you must love being a park ranger. I have to say it was probably the best job I've ever had. Just being outside, talking to people about their parks, having a great day. I remember seldom having a day with stress as a park ranger. Now, there were some days when people were lost or got injured, and that obviously you've got to be serious in those instances, but I don't remember ever having a bad commute to work when I was a park ranger. Another one from my dad. I didn't plan him. Yeah, go ahead.
About the guy that said, when did the bears come out?
I don't remember that one. But okay. It's not okay. So my dad's asking me. I was at an evening program one night. I was getting ready to do a ranger talk, and this guy came up to me in the parking lot, and he says, I've been in Glacier for 3 days now. I have not seen a bear, not one bear. I don't believe there are any bears in Glacier Park. Basically asking he wanted his money back. And I'm like, well, I've been here all summer. I've seen probably 600 bears since I've been here, a lot of them from the road. I can guarantee you there are a lot of bears here in Glacier. I'm sorry you haven't seen them. And he had a little dog, on his a leash. And I looked down, and his dog is now just barking like crazy, just mad. And I look down at the dog, and then I slowly look up at the man, and his face is white as a ghost, just white. So the hairs on the back of my neck just kind of go up, and so I slowly do this, just turn, and there's a black bear not 25 feet behind us, just kind of walking, through the campground. And so I'm like this, I'm like, okay, can we get your dog to quiet down, and we're just going to slowly walk. And I turn around, and the guy has run off all the way out back to his car. So I turned back around, and the bear couldn't care less. He's just walking through the campground, doing about his stuff, and I just kind of watched him take off, and he went through and went on off. So those things you can't really script, but that's the type of stuff park rangers deal with every single day. Yellowstone, one more story if you'll let me. And I don't know if I told you guys this, but in Yellowstone, like I said, it's a super volcano, and the ground is very thin. Normally, the crust of the earth is about 40 to 60 miles thick, but in Yellowstone, it's only 3 miles thick. So that molten rock is just below the surface, paper thin. But there also is a culture that surrounds Yellowstone. There's a lot of people that don't trust the federal government. And so one time this gentleman came up, he's like, so I've been hearing about all of these tunnels under Yellowstone where they've got UN troops that are in there, that they're just waiting for an invasion. They'll come out and they'll take over the United States. I mean, this gets so intense. If you look at the back of highway signs, if you ever noticed on the back of those as you're driving that there seems to be like little numbers or things on that, those are supposedly signals to the European drivers because they're used to driving on the right or left side of the road. They'll know where to go when they get here, and that's how intense it is. Anyway, so he's like, well, I've heard about these tunnels. I know there are tunnels in Yellowstone. Where are they? You're going to tell me where they are? I'm like, well, at that time, I was a GS5 ranger, which is about as low as you can go as a seasonal ranger. I said, look, I'm a GS5 ranger. I'm seasonal. They don't tell me everything in my job. But there are billions of gallons of boiling hot water under this park. I seriously doubt there are any UN tunnels under here. And he looks at me and goes, you're one of them. So all of those types of things are fodder for my books. I talk about those and the ideas, and what I really liked is that I remember seeing James Bond movies when I was growing up, and so it's how you kind of project yourself into that persona. But James spends a lot of his time in foreign countries and exotic locales that maybe a lot of people, at least when I was growing up, you'd never been to. I wanted to put my hero in a place that millions of Americans have been to and could go, I've been there, I've stood where Grayson Cole stood, I could see myself doing that. And so that's the combination of a park ranger that's iconic, places that are iconic, but also those threats that are borderline real, that we're really confronting every day. So, sorry, my mom.
I'm just referring back to this lady asked, do you ever put anybody's know in books? That's about 4 years ago. I got Sean a t-shirt and it
Yeah.
said,
Better be nice.
you could be in my next book.
Well, you better be, yeah, so the t-shirt my mom said, you better be careful, I may put you in my book and kill you off. So, so I try not to do that. But you know, you never know. Maybe my next book. What time is it? I gotta be done at 5, 10 after 4. Oh, we got plenty of time. Really? No, we got lots of time. We got lots of time. So, a whole nother hour if need be. Any other questions? Any of my ranger friends have questions? Yeah, go ahead. I will in a minute. Yeah. Any other questions? No? We're good? All right, so what I thought I'd do is read from the first chapter of this book. This might be a little difficult holding it and reading it at the same time.
Do you want me to hold the mic?
Yeah, if you want to. This is my wife. The whole family.
Whole family came.
So this, so I'm going to read from the prologue to my book just to start. It's only a couple pages, but this will talk about the idea how I got started. 6 pages. So bear with me. I'm not the best at reading to a crowd, but reading inside. So prologue: Airspace, Mount Rainier National Park, June 24th, 1947. Kenneth Arnold, who was the guy in the newspaper that we just saw. Kenneth Arnold was a 32-year-old founder of the Great Western Fire Control Company. Born in Minnesota, he grew up in western Montana and was the chief executive of a fire suppression business. This job required frequent travel, including many trips throughout the Pacific Northwest. Arnold decided that getting his pilot's license would ease the stress of travel. You're going to have to hold it up here. He bought one of the 16 Model AZ aircraft built by the Call Air for civilian flight. The A2 was a low-wing, 2-seater craft. It had a single Linacomb 0290 engine, creating about 125 horsepower. That horsepower produced a top engine speed of 140 miles an hour and a range of approximately 350 miles. Its operating ceiling was just under 16,000 feet. That ceiling wouldn't matter today, as Arnold piloted his plane from Chehalis, Washington to Yakima. He departed Chehalis at 2:15 p.m. and was over the tiny western Washington mining town of Mineral about 45 minutes later. The day was exceptionally clear, with more than 150 miles of visibility in every direction. The towering 14,410-foot snow-capped Mount Rainier was off to his left. Mount St. Helens, the Fuji-like young volcano, was off to his right. The equally impressive and broad Mount Adams was ahead and just to his right. Way off in the distance, to his left, was Mount Baker, which sat astride the United States-Canadian border. The mountains reminded Arnold of giant scoops of ice cream, as if some supergiant had walked from Oregon to Canada, dropping enormous sundaes every 50 miles or so. Truly beautiful. Arnold banked his plane slightly to the left until his compass read 45 degrees. The change in course would add a few extra minutes to his flight to the farming community of Yakima, but this extra time was worth it. The Army was offering a $5,000 reward to anyone who located the wreckage of a U.S. Marine Corps C-46 transport that had crashed on the slopes of Mount Rainier 6 months before. That actually happened. There was a plane transport that was coming up after the war from San Francisco. They were flying into Seattle. 6 of those planes, it was so cloudy that they got disoriented. I think 4 of which went back, 2 of which went on, 1 of which crashed into Mount Rainier. The Marine transport plane had been one of 6 planes headed from San Diego to Seattle, carrying more than 200 Marines. The pilots were flying on instruments at roughly 9,000 feet. The weather was bad that December day, forcing 4 planes to turn back. Two pushed on, one making it eventually to Seattle. The other was blown badly off course and never made it to its final destination. The military believed the plane flew into the Tahoma Glacier on Mount Rainier's western slope. The military had searched and had failed to locate the plane, thus the reward. Arnold slowed his airspeed slightly by pulling back on the throttle. If he was to spot the wreckage, speed wasn't necessary. He needed to maximize his time over the suspected crash site. The Tahoma Glacier was a massive river of slow-flowing ice. It covered nearly a quarter of the volcano's west side. It was an enormous area to search. No wonder the military hadn't found the downed plane, Arnold thought, as he began his scan of the winter wonderland below. He'd only been searching for about 15 minutes, but began to think the effort was fruitless. But on the off chance that he would spot something, he pushed on. A few more minutes of searching and Arnold concluded it was hopeless. He began the slow right-hand turn back to his original course when a bright flashing light off to his left caught his eye. "What the hell is that?" Arnold said. Said aloud. The flashing light reminded him of sunbeams bouncing off a mirror. Odd, he thought. He ended his turn and brought his wings level flight in order to get a better view. Prior to leaving Chehalis, Arnold filed a flight plan before taking off and had been told by the air traffic control that the skies would be clear that day, nearly empty on the trip. A few planes that he was alerted to would be coming from the south, not the north. Yet there were the flashing objects, or was it on second look, there was a flashing object, but on second look, objects. 1, 2, 3, Arnold counted to himself. On closer inspection, he concluded there were 9, maybe 10 distinct objects closing from the north. It was hard to tell. The flashing made it hard to count, but he finally settled on 9. These have to be reflections, Arnold thought. The sun was playing tricks on me. He took off his sunglasses. Perhaps they were causing the effect. Nope, the lights were still there. Maybe the plane's windows were at fault. The pilot rolled his plane back and forth, but the objects remained in their current positions. The plane's movement had no impact upon the flashing lights. No, the flashing lights were coming from real objects. What's going on? Arnold could see that the craft was going to pass directly in front of him, so he pushed the throttle forward. The engines revved, increasing its RPMs and airspeed. Perhaps I can get close enough to see what these craft are. Arnold continued to track the lights. Yes, they were clearly 9 distinct objects. They flew almost in a straight line. Birds wouldn't do that. A new type of airplane, perhaps? Wow, they are moving fast. Arnold checked his watch. He'd first seen the lights over Mount Baker just 5 minutes and 17 seconds before, but now they were racing in front of Mount Rainier. That's more than 150 miles in little more than 300 seconds. He did a quick calculation in his head and came to the startling speed of 1,700 miles an hour. That can't be right. America doesn't have anything that can move that fast. Arnold had read World War II reports on the Americans' capture of Nazi technology, including jet airplanes, but everything he'd read indicated that the planes could at best reach 650 miles per hour. These craft were obviously going nearly 3 times that speed. Arnold pushed his craft up to its maximum. He wanted to get closer. The flashing objects were passing right in front of him. Arnold could easily make out their shape now. They were dark, incredibly thin, crescent-shaped objects. When viewed from the side, they seemed to disappear. The objects broke formation and began erratically flying around Mount Rainier's central peak. The jerking flight path reminded Arnold of the movements of a startled cat. First in one place, then another, then still another. That's impossible. But there it was. The objects were jumping all around, all over the place. It appeared they were looking for something on the mountain, just as he was. That can't be happening. But like Arnold, the objects eventually gave up their search and reformed a straight line formation and headed at supersonic speed toward Mount Adams, some 50 miles to the southeast. Arnold watched them passing the second volcano and disappear from view. He pulled back on the throttle, slowing the craft to its normal cruising speed. He checked his watch again. I must be going crazy, he concluded. The entire episode had lasted less than 7 minutes. So that's the beginning. So, yeah.
Say something.
Oh, okay, my mom wants to come up. Okay. All right, there you go.
I know many of you already know Sean.
Hold it up closer to you.
But I just want to give you the history of why he is so enthralled with the national parks. When Sean was little, Gil was in the Army, and we were at Fort Ord. And from there, we started taking Sean and his younger brother Mark to the national parks. We went to Yosemite, to Sequoia. We then moved to Fort Lewis. We came up to Mount Rainier many, many times, went up to the North Cascades and to the Olympics. And then we moved to Alaska, and we had a camper, and we went to Denali, and all of the places that we were so interested in. And we're dragging Sean and his brother with us.
Dragging.
And then we moved back to Spokane. We still had that camper, and we said, we're going to really see the Northwest parks. Well, we went to Glacier, and we absolutely fell in love with Glacier. And as Sean would tell it, every summer, that's where we went, in that little camper. And he would say, I'm so sick of that park. My friends go to Disneyland and to Hawaii, and we go to Glacier Park.
Glacier National Park.
And so we said, that's too bad. You can do that when you got kids, but we're going to do this. This is what we're exposing you to. Took him back to Washington, D.C. and saw all the monuments, etc. Well,
Fast
forward, and Sean is at GS5 Ranger at Glacier Park. And he's going to lead a hike with young families up to Avalanche Lake, which is one of the easiest hikes in Glacier Park. So we're walking, Gil and I are there, and we're walking, and Sean's telling people about the botany and the biology and everything, and we got up to the lake, and Sean then told that story and said, you know, at the time I said, if I never see this park again, I'd be happy. Now I would give anything if I could live here the rest of my life. So we feel like we have some investment in all these books as well.
So yeah, I actually worked that into some of my talks, talking about how every summer we go to Crummy Glacier National Park. And you'd see the kids, some of the kids, yeah, Crummy Glacier National Park, yeah. But I said, you know what? Some of your kids may not thank you now, but in 20 years, they will thank you for dragging them to the national park. So continue to do that. So anyway.
So sometimes parents make good decisions.
They do make good, sometimes they make good decisions, exactly.
Affirmation.
Yeah.
But I want to share that as his wife, we go to the national parks and we go to Disneyland.
Yeah, and we go to, yes.
We do both
Yes.
because we're big Disney people.
So that's my talk. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer those, but I really do appreciate everyone coming out. Yes, Kevin?
When's your next book out?
So, like I said, I'm about 15,000, when is my next book coming out? I'm about 15,000 words into the current book. As I said, it's a much harder write for me, so I'm actually having to figure out, how I'm going to create this mystery and get it to where it needs to. I'm hoping this time next year it'll be out, so then it'll be ready for Christmas and that sort of thing, and maybe I'll be at Glacier giving a talk on that one, so we'll see. But I'm continually working on it. One of the things that helps is people continually ask me, when's my next book out? When's my next book out? So I have to keep writing in order to get that next book out. So I'm working on it. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming out and spending the afternoon with me. I know you have a ton of things you could be doing, but to spend time with me really means a lot. So thank you very much.